On the frozen fields of Stalingrad, thousands of German soldiers met their end in the most brutal battle in history. The casualties were massive, but the difficulty of burying the dead was even greater. The frozen ground, with temperatures reaching 40 degrees below zero, made it nearly impossible to dig proper graves. Many of these bodies were looted by Red Army soldiers, who searched for documents and valuables before incinerating them in large pits and covering them with soil. The lack of time, resources, and humanity left thousands of German families unaware of the final fate of their loved ones. Some were marked with crosses made of rubble or German helmets placed on stones. Others bore symbols of the Nazi army, such as the swastika or the Iron Cross, indicating that in the early days of the battle, there was more time and resources to give them a proper burial. Stalingrad, the mass grave of German soldiers. The Battle of Stalingrad is recognized as one of the most fierce and brutal in military history, and it undoubtedly marked a turning point in World War II. The city was reduced to ashes by the relentless German siege, while the Soviets resisted every street and every house, in a struggle where meters were measured in corpses and not in steps. The Russian winter, ruthless and freezing, froze both the ground and the hopes of the German soldiers, encircled by the Soviet counterattack. The dead accumulated relentlessly. More than 1 million soldiers and civilians lost their lives in this bloody campaign, and the Axis casualties reached staggering figures. The highest estimates suggest that they could be around 1.5 million men. The conditions were so inhuman that the bodies, stiff and frozen, remained as grim monuments to horror. What happened to those corpses? Well, let's find out. But first, the context of that massacre. In August of 1942, before the events began, Europe was deeply mired in the turmoil of World War II. The confrontations between the Axis powers and the Allies had reached an unprecedented intensity, marked by Germany's expansive military campaigns and profound social and political transformations in the Soviet Union. Since June of 1941, with the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the German advance had placed the Soviet army in a critical position. Under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union faced the loss of vast territories in the western part of its territory. Key cities like Kiev and Smolensk had fallen to German forces, and the threat was already looming over Moscow. The lack of experienced commanders complicated efforts to stop the Nazi advance and generated distrust within the military high command. At the same time, Hitler's Germany was experiencing the height of its territorial expansion. By 1942, the Axis forces had conquered France, the Netherlands, and extensive areas of Eastern Europe. Their strategy, based on rapid movements and encirclement maneuvers, had proven effective, but as they approached Stalingrad, it began to reveal signs of overextension. Socially, the Soviet Union was experiencing an extreme degree of mobilization for the war. Men of all ages were sent to the front, while women took on roles traditionally reserved for them in factories, farms, and administrative positions. Soviet propaganda, designed to unify the population, emphasized heroic resistance against fascism, while trying to placate ethnic tensions in the heterogeneous Soviet territory. However, bombings, food shortages, and extreme winter conditions punished civilians, who had to adapt to a life of constant hardship. In the territories occupied by Germany, the outlook was bleak. Nazi repression included mass executions, deportations, and the systematic implementation of the Holocaust. Despite the fear, resistance movements emerged, with clandestine operations aimed at obstructing German control. Meanwhile, Nazi propaganda sought to maintain high morale among its citizens and soldiers, promoting the narrative of racial supremacy and the inevitable destiny of victory. In this way, Stalingrad was shaping up to be a crucial strategic objective for both sides. For Germany, its capture meant securing the southern flank and controlling access to the oil of the Caucasus. For the Soviet Union, the city's defense became a symbol of resistance. The pressure on all fronts, both military and social, created an extremely tense scenario that anticipated one of the most decisive confrontations of World War II. The city's geographical location, situated on the banks of the Volga River, granted it enormous strategic value. This river served as an essential route for transporting Soviet troops and supplies. Additionally, The city offered a direct access point to the oil fields of the Caucasus, which were critical for keeping the German war machine running. For the Nazis, capturing the urban center not only promised a logistical advance but a symbolic blow. The city bore the name of the Soviet leader, making it an emblem of Soviet resistance whose fall could demoralize the enemy and grant Adolf Hitler a significant propaganda victory. In the summer of 1941, Operation Barbarossa marked the beginning of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. This initial advance was rapid and devastating, with conquests that left the Soviet army reeling. However, by the end of that same year, the German offensive began to stall. The fierce resistance of the Red Army, combined with logistical problems and severe winter conditions, halted the Nazi momentum. By mid-1942, Hitler sought to resume his offensive, focusing on the city as part of a broader plan to weaken Soviet defenses and secure vital resources. This conflict was also a manifestation of the deep ideological divisions between the sides. Nazi Germany, driven by Hitler's ideology, saw the Soviet Union as the main enemy of National Socialism. The conquest of Eastern Europe was essential to achieve Lebensraum, or living space. On the other hand, the Soviet regime under Stalin presented the struggle as an existential confrontation against fascism, completely opposed to communism. Overconfidence in the capabilities of their troops led Nazi leaders to make significant strategic mistakes. They underestimated both Soviet resistance and the logistical challenges inherent in the campaign. As German supply lines became overstretched, the Red Army seized the opportunity to reorganize. The Soviets implemented more effective defensive strategies and mobilized their vast human and material resources, preparing the ground for the resistance in Stalingrad. The Battle of the Rats. Every street a trap, every building a tomb. On the 23rd of August, 1942 marked the beginning of that historic battle. In the early hours of that morning, the sky over the city darkened under the roar of Luftwaffe planes. The German air operation unleashed a massive bombardment that reduced large parts of the city to rubble and ashes. During that day, it is estimated that nearly 5,000 civilians died, trapped amid the attacks that did not distinguish between military targets and residential areas. As the bombs continued to fall, the German 6th Army troops began their ground advance. Their strategy sought to consolidate a strategic position on the banks of the Volga River, key to controlling access to the south of the Soviet Union and the valuable oil resources of the Caucasus. The German vanguard, equipped with heavy artillery and tanks, advanced rapidly through the outskirts of the city, encountering little initial resistance due to the surprise and psychological impact of the bombardment. By nightfall, the Germans had reached the river, establishing a crucial foothold in their offensive. However, as they entered Stalingrad, the landscape changed drastically. The Soviet soldiers, organized into urban defense units, began to respond with tactics designed to turn every street and building into a deadly trap. The city transformed into a hostile labyrinth for the German forces, giving rise to what the combatants themselves would call Rattenkrieg, or Rat War. This term reflected the brutal nature of the battles taking place in basements, factories, rooftops, and ruins. Hand-to-hand fighting intensified as the Germans tried to consolidate their advance. The Soviet resistance, far from breaking, used their knowledge of the terrain to ambush the enemy and wear down their forces. Snipers, ambushes, and surprise attacks became recurring tactics, making it difficult for the Germans to maintain their supply lines and control the captured areas. Meanwhile, the civilians remaining in the city faced a parallel struggle for survival, trapped between the fighting and the smoldering ruins. In September, the fighting reached a new level of intensity. From the first days of the month, the German 6th Army troops under General Friedrich Paulus's command continued their advance towards the heart of the city. Between the 1st and the 14th of that month, the German divisions managed to penetrate deeply into Stalingrad, facing street fighting of extreme violence. One of the most significant advances was by the 71st Division, which reached the city center and approached the main pier, a strategic location for Soviet supply. The 15th of September marked a change in the dynamic of the confrontation. The Red Army, led by General Vasily Chuikov, received crucial reinforcements with the arrival of the 13th Guards Rifle Division. This elite unit was immediately sent to the most critical points of the front. where, despite suffering around 30% casualties on its first day of combat, it managed to halt the German advance in several key areas of the city. As September progressed, between the 14th and the 26th, the fighting intensified even more. The Luftwaffe's nightly bombings became constant, maintaining incessant pressure on the Soviet positions. Meanwhile, Soviet snipers began to play a crucial role, destabilizing German lines by specifically targeting officers and sowing chaos among the Sixth Army troops. In the last days of the month, between the 27th and the 30th of September, Paulus launched a massive offensive in a desperate attempt to take Stalingrad before the onset of winter. This attack focused on strategic points such as Mamayev Kurgan and the Barricade and Red October factories. The fighting in these areas was extremely bloody, with estimated casualties of around 2,500 German soldiers and 6,000 Soviets during the first days of the offensive. Throughout September, the weather conditions began to deteriorate with the arrival of autumn. The troops of both sides faced not only the horrors of combat, but also hunger, cold, and disease. The lack of supplies became a critical challenge, exacerbating the difficulties of sustaining military operations in such a devastating scenario. In the first days of October, the German forces found themselves in an apparently advantageous position, having captured over 90% of the city. However, each advance came at a cost. The Red Army had adopted a tenacious and fragmented defense strategy, using urban tactics that turned every building and street into a trench. This approach significantly slowed the German advance. As October progressed, the fighting became even bloodier. Between the 11th and the 20th, the Germans attempted to consolidate their positions, launching additional offensives to eliminate Soviet resistance pockets. However, the Soviet defense remained solid, supported by guerrilla tactics and the effectiveness of their snipers, who constantly attacked German officers, undermining the Sixth Army's morale. The Soviet forces, although diminished, received reinforcements and supplies sufficient to continue resisting. The Germans, on the other hand, began to face logistical difficulties, with increasingly scarce supplies due to constant Soviet attacks on their supply lines. November began with even fiercer Soviet resistance. From the first day of the month, the Red Army reinforced its defense of Stalingrad, maintaining control of several key positions. The celebrations of the 7th anniversary of the Russian Revolution on the 7th of November served as a moral boost for the Soviet troops, who redoubled their efforts in defense. Moreover, Soviet leaders did not limit themselves to resisting. During this same period, they began to prepare an offensive that would change the course of the battle and, consequently, of World War II. On the 19th of November, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus. This carefully planned attack aimed to surround and isolate the German Sixth Army, taking advantage of the weaknesses of the Romanian and Italian armies protecting the German flanks. In a matter of days, the Soviet forces broke through enemy lines in several points, closing a ring around the city. By the 23rd of November, approximately 330,000 German troops were trapped in an area of 40 to 60 kilometers, facing the imminence of the relentless winter with no possibility of escape. The immediate impact of Operation Uranus was devastating for the German forces. Isolated and under constant attack, the soldiers of the Sixth Army began to experience a collapse of morale. German attempts to break the encirclement were unsuccessful, while Soviet troops strengthened their control over the perimeter. The conflict shifted from a struggle for control of the city to a siege marking the progressive German defeat. December was no better for the Germans. Supplies began to run low, and soldier morale was at a low point. During the first days of the month, the German command's strategy focused on holding out while awaiting a rescue operation that promised to relieve Soviet pressure. This hope materialized in the form of Operation Wintergewitter, launched on the 12th of December. This operation was a desperate attempt to break the Soviet encirclement. Led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the offensive began with notable initial success. German troops advanced rapidly northeastward, surprising Soviet forces and penetrating up to 60 kilometers on the first day. However, as the advance progressed, Soviet lines began to regroup and present increasingly fierce resistance. Between the 13th and 19th, the German advance nearly halted due to a series of Soviet counteroffensives. On the 16th of December, the Soviets launched Operation Little Saturn, a strategic move designed to attack the flanks of Army Group Don, mostly supported by Italian troops. This attack further complicated the German position, forcing von Manstein to redirect critical resources to try to contain the threat on their flanks. Although German troops held their position for a few more days, Soviet pressure was too much. Finally, between the 22nd and 24th of December, the German High Command decided to cancel the operation. The forces involved in Wintergewitter received orders to retreat, leaving the German Sixth Army trapped in the urban agglomeration with no hope of rescue. With the new year, conditions for German soldiers in Stalingrad became desperate. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, aggravating the lack of food, medicine, and ammunition. As the days passed, the German forces, weakened by hunger and disease, found themselves unable to mount significant resistance. The Red Army took advantage of the situation to consolidate its control over the surrounding area, reinforcing the encirclement and launching targeted attacks on strategic positions. The massacre continued unabated. During the 18th and 19th of January, the Soviets launched a series of decisive offensives. These actions finally crushed the last organized attempts at resistance by the Germans. Soviet forces systematically advanced, reducing enemy positions and forcing thousands of German soldiers to surrender. By the end of the month, the German troops, completely surrounded and in critical condition, faced an inevitable outcome. On the 1st of February, Soviet forces intensified their pressure on the remnants of the Sixth Army, which was entrenched in ruins and basements. The conditions of the German soldiers, needless to say, were deplorable. Despite the general desperation, some factions within the army still harbored hopes of an unlikely breakout, although the reality was evident. There would be no rescue. On the 2nd of February, German resistance completely collapsed. Faced with the impossibility of holding positions, General Friedrich Paulus made the historic decision to surrender. This act marked the first time a German field marshal was captured by the enemy, a fact that resonated deeply within the Third Reich's military command. In his message to the troops, Paulus ordered the cessation of hostilities, formally ending the battle. Approximately 91,000 German soldiers, weakened by weeks of all kinds of deprivations, surrendered to Soviet forces. The scenes within the encirclement were devastating. The surviving soldiers, many reduced to a skeletal state, emerged from the ruins to surrender. Most lacked adequate clothing for the freezing temperatures, and some even walked barefoot on the icy snow. The bodies of those who had succumbed to hunger or disease lay everywhere, physical evidence of the human cost of the prolonged resistance. This power shift on the Eastern Front marked the beginning of a series of Soviet and Allied offensives that would culminate in the defeat of the Third Reich in 1945. The echo of the fallen and the discovery of history, the mass graves of Stalingrad. Now, the Battle of Stalingrad represented one of the most devastating and deadly episodes of World War II. This confrontation, which took place in the heart of a key industrial city, left behind a trail of destruction and suffering that affected both soldiers and civilians caught in the middle of the conflict. Life there during those events was a constant struggle for survival. Soldiers on both sides had to endure extreme conditions. The shortage of food, ammunition, and medical supplies was alarming. Many lived in improvised shelters, constructed from the ruins of buildings destroyed by bombings. These offered minimal protection against the winter temperatures, which could drop to 30 degrees Celsius below zero. Without adequate winter clothing, the troops suffered severe frostbite, often resulting in amputations. Additionally, the constant threat of bombings and the stalking of snipers added immense psychological burden. Meanwhile, civilians, mostly trapped in the city due to lack of evacuation, fared no better. The massive destruction of homes and infrastructure forced them to seek shelter in basements and improvised shelters. Without access to food or clean water, many resorted to scavenging for any available resource. Malnutrition was widespread, and the trauma of witnessing daily violence left indelible scars on the population. The Russian winter, historically known for its harshness, amplified the already unbearable hardships of the siege. The freezing temperatures not only diminished the combat capacity of the soldiers, but also claimed lives. On both sides, the cold wreaked havoc. Morale plummeted and casualties increased due to diseases related to prolonged exposure. Civilians, for their part, fought against hypothermia in buildings without heating or windows, with many families huddled together in small spaces to try to stay warm. There were no coats or fires, just ice and snow. The human cost was overwhelming. Estimates made during the years immediately following the event place the total number of casualties, including dead, wounded, and missing, between 1.2 million and 2.5 million. Of these, the Red Army suffered around 1.1 million casualties, while German and Allied forces accounted for approximately 800,000. Thousands of deaths were recorded each day amid a confrontation that redefined the concept of urban warfare. The chaos of urban combat complicated the recording of losses. Although both sides maintained documentation systems, the circumstances meant many soldiers went unaccounted for. Mass burials, often hastily conducted to prevent the spread of disease, were common among both Soviets and Germans. These improvised burials left countless bodies unidentified, buried in mass graves that are still being discovered today. As the battle dragged on, the intensity of the combat turned Stalingrad into an earthly hell. The city's ruins became the stage for hand-to-hand combat, where soldiers on both sides waged war in basements, factories, and rubble. Surprise attacks from basements, factories, and sewers caused constant casualties, creating an atmosphere of absolute terror. The Soviet resistance, reinforced by Stalin's order of not one step back, meant any attempt to retreat by the troops was punished with immediate execution. This measure, implemented by the NKVD, ensured that soldiers fought to their last breath. For the residents of the devastated city, the situation was equally desperate. Most were not evacuated, and amid the fighting they faced a lack of food and shelter, while water became a dangerous resource to obtain due to snipers. In this desperate scenario, orphaned children were forced by German soldiers to collect water under the threat of starvation, becoming direct victims of the conflict. When the Soviets discovered this practice, they even shot at the children carrying out these missions. As Operation Uranus took shape and the encirclement against the Germans tightened, casualties increased exponentially. Many soldiers died from cold, starvation, or disease before Soviet forces regained control of the city in 1943. The surrender of German forces, led by Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, marked the end of such hostility. Over 100,000 German soldiers were captured, but most perished in Soviet prisoner camps. However, the magnitude of the horror continued to come to light over the decades. At the end of it all, the first evidence of the human devastation caused by the confrontation began to emerge. In the days following the surrender of the German Sixth Army, mass graves were located in various parts of the city, many of them in the open air and others covered by the rubble of destroyed buildings. The first excavations revealed hundreds of bodies, mixed between Soviet soldiers, Germans, and civilians, marking the beginning of an extensive identification and documentation process that would not end there. Since then, the initiated process has involved a combination of forensic, archaeological, and technological methods that have evolved over time, adapting to the conditions and challenges of a terrain devastated by conflict. Initially, prospecting the terrain was crucial in locating areas where the existence of mass graves was suspected. Detailed terrain analyses were carried out, looking for surface alterations that would reveal the presence of buried bodies. Georeferencing techniques were fundamental at this stage, allowing the identification of patterns in the landscape that indicated potential burial sites. Regarding the identification of remains, the first step was usually a visual inspection. Forensic professionals, and in some cases relatives, tried to recognize the deceased from visible physical features, such as scars, tattoos, or distinctive clothing. However, this method had serious limitations due to the advanced decomposition of many bodies. Identification would later be supported by technical alternatives in the coming years. The exact coordinates of the graves, the condition of the remains, and any associated evidence such as personal effects or uniform fragments were precisely documented. Between 1945 and 1946, with World War II coming to an end, systematic efforts to register mass graves intensified. The findings from that time were not encouraging. The extreme conditions of the battle, characterized by incessant bombings and hand-to-hand combat, were reflected in the human remains found. Many victims showed signs of wounds from explosions, shrapnel and bullets, while others exhibited malnutrition or exposure to extreme cold. During the 50s, excavations continued, this time with a focus on preservation and historical memory. In various locations of the city where the largest graves were found, memorials were established to honor the fallen. Archaeological work revealed not only bodies, but also personal objects such as watches, letters, and photographs, which allowed partial reconstruction of the stories of those buried. The findings also included uniforms and medals, many still worn by the soldiers at the time of burial. For this effort, metal detectors were added as an auxiliary tool to locate metallic objects associated with the bodies, such as buckles, medals, or weapons. In parallel, trained dogs were employed to detect human remains, which proved particularly useful in areas where other methods could not be effectively applied. These animals, trained to locate remains at different levels of decomposition, facilitated the discovery of graves that would otherwise have gone unnoticed. Once suspicious areas were identified, preliminary surveys were conducted. These consisted of small excavations aimed at confirming the presence of remains before proceeding with a complete exhumation. This method minimized the risk of damaging the bodies or objects that might be buried with them. To overcome the difficulty of identifying bodies, more precise techniques such as fingerprint comparison were used. This method, although effective, depended on the availability of previous records, something that was not always guaranteed in a wartime context. Forensic dentistry then became a key resource. Dentists compared existing dental X-rays with the recovered teeth, achieving identifications in cases where other methods were unfeasible. By the 80s, with advancements in archaeological technologies, more detailed investigations were conducted in previously overlooked areas. New mass graves were discovered, and analysis methods allowed for the classification not only of human remains, but also of weapons and ammunition found alongside them. Among the unearthed artifacts were rifles, pistols, and grenades, preserved in varying conditions, which helped to better understand the tactics employed during the siege. The findings were not limited to military elements. Household utensils, clothing fragments, and tools belonging to civilians who lived or died in Stalingrad were found. The utensils, many of them improvised, evidenced the survival strategies adopted by the population in a context of extreme scarcity. By the 2000s, the investigations became even more exhaustive. Excavations organized by international teams of archaeologists brought to light an additional amount of remains and artifacts. The analysis of these new evidences provided deeper details about the conditions in which the inhabitants and combatants lived and died during the siege. For example, certain artifacts showed how civilians tried to adapt to the war environment, transforming everyday objects into tools for survival or even into rudimentary weapons. Likewise, with the technological advances of the time, DNA extraction and analysis became the most reliable and definitive method to identify the bodies. Samples of all kinds were taken and compared with genetic records of relatives or pre-existing databases. In 2018, more than 70 years later, during construction work in Volgograd, the modern name of the place of events, workers discovered a mass grave 130 meters long and almost 3 meters deep. Inside were the remains of 1,837 German soldiers, along with horses used in the battle. The archaeologists managed to identify some of the soldiers thanks to their identification tags, and their families finally obtained answers about their fates. However, many of the bodies had no identification marks, and the mystery of their identity remains unsolved. The 2018 discovery, though shocking, was not isolated. Each year, 3 to 4 mass graves are discovered in former Stalingrad, revealing fragments of the brutality that characterized that chapter of history. This grave, located in the Angarsky district, is just one of many that remain buried in the bowels of the city. A year later, the exhumed bodies were buried with honors in the German cemetery of Rososhka, about 37 kilometers northwest of Volgograd, in an effort to dignify the memory of the fallen. This almost always happened. Whenever mass graves were found, strict protocols were established to ensure dignified treatment of the exhumed remains. Whenever possible, identified bodies were buried in individual graves, properly marked to facilitate future location. In situations where logistical conditions or the number of victims made it impossible, collective graves were used, respecting international humanitarian norms. In cases where local authorities could not handle the magnitude of the task, humanitarian organizations took an active role. These entities provided resources, expertise, and a rigorous approach that ensured compliance with international standards in the treatment of human remains. Interdisciplinary collaboration and coordination between different actors were essential to face the logistical and ethical challenges presented by this work. Thus, the discoveries continue to offer a grim reminder of the scale of the conflict and the human cost of war. It is estimated that around 2 million people died in the battle and its surroundings. Many of them, both Soviet and German, remain buried in mass graves that have yet to be found and investigated.